In 1972, Hunter Davies released a book which documented his experiences spending a whole season behind the scenes with Bill Nicholson's Tottenham Hotspur.
And Knowles now for Spurs. Gilsey, Chivers, Peters. To Chivers, good ball! 1-0.
Spurs free kick from an interesting position, almost central, middle right of central. Some 10 yards outside the area. Peters taking it quickly, Chivers going in! Oh, and a goal by Chivers! Superbly taken by the Spurs!
Davies's book, The Glory Game, offers an eye-opening account of football in the 1970s, with a level of intimacy that gave the book a real edge as a piece of football history.
I can reflect back to being a player with and manager of some of the finest players that have ever been in the game. And naturally, I'm a Tottenham man, obviously.
Nearly 50 years later, global mega company Amazon are offering a comparative experience. But where Hunter Davies went in armed with a notepad and pencil, Amazon take us behind the scenes with video cameras and microphones.
That's where my mother sits, that's where my sister sits, everyone's family sits, and our parents have to stand there and have someone 2 rows in front of you calling you a fucking son of a bitch and a prick and shit and this, and you think it's okay.
I play once every 4 weeks. Do you want me to be man of the match and you want me to give my best performance when I play one game and then I don't play again for 3 or 4 weeks? The defence has kept 2 clean sheets. They play every game. It's not fair.
There is no time to say fuck off. There is no time to be disappointed. There is no time to jog back. There is no time to complain. There is no time to touch your balls.
In this episode, we ask, what did we learn from All or Nothing, Amazon's television docu-series about Spurs?
I found it very interesting.
Jack Pitt-Brook covers Tottenham and England for The Athletic.
It is obviously not a documentary in the conventional sense of the word, I think.
You're someone who's had a lot of engagement behind the scenes at Spurs. How does the representation of the club on All or Nothing feel to you as a journalist?
I guess there's a few different ways to answer that. The first is that, and this is going to make me sound incredibly vain, I enjoyed seeing myself on there. So I'm on there, I think maybe you can see me 2 or 3 times, just like sat gormlessly. There's a few of them are like sat gormlessly at a press conference, and one of them sat gormlessly on a Zoom press conference. It shows how the world changed. As a journalist, it is just quite funny seeing journalism recorded and shown on this documentary series. Like, it relies quite heavily on press conferences that Mourinho did. You see lots of journalists asking questions, and the questions are shown, and then Mourinho's response. They even show you like Mourinho having meetings with the head of comms, Simon Felstein, before press conferences, saying, "Oh, you're going to get asked about this, you're going to get asked about that," and sure enough, he does. In terms of the overall portrayal of the club, well, there are a lot of interesting details and moments in there, like stuff that I didn't know that happened and that I was curious to actually see, like especially Mourinho's meetings with players I thought were fascinating, particularly with Dyer, Dele, Kane. Mourinho's team talks and team meetings were interesting. The Mourinho's meeting with Danny Rose, which of course we all know about.
It's not fair.
It's your perspective.
It's not fair. It's facts. The whole changing room know it's facts. It's not fair. And Daniel, I'm going to see Daniel as well. So when Daniel's in, tell him I'm looking for him.
I think you are an honest guy.
Yeah, I am, but that's the problem.
I think you should.
Yeah, I will.
So you learn a lot of details that you wouldn't otherwise know. And then I guess there's another question wrapped up in this, which is like, is it journalism? Like, is this a form of journalism? Does it represent the club in a way that a journalist would? I think on that one, it just feels a little bit too edited, a bit too pre-approved, if that's the right way of putting it. It feels to me slightly more like sponsored content, for want of a better phrase.
Two of the principal players in the series are Jose Mourinho and Daniel Levy. What did you make of the portrayals of these two figures from what you know about the reality of them?
Well, I think Mourinho is fascinating. I think Mourinho's vanity is really the engine of the show.
You said that people have perceptions of you. What do they say?
The guy never smiles. The guy is ruthless. I think this is the perception.
And what's the truth?
The truth is that there is some truth on it.
He comes in 22 minutes into the first episode, even though in reality he came in at like the end of November. So Pochettino had had a good few months in charge last season. And while Pochettino didn't particularly want this to happen, Mourinho was obviously much more on board with it. And it's Mourinho's desire to have everything filmed and shown to the world so he can prove how smart he is that makes it so entertaining. Obviously, we're aware that we're seeing a version of Mourinho that he wants the world to see. So he is, in a sense, performing and acting, probably almost more so than anyone else on it. But he's so big in it that he seems to occupy almost like a narrative role. Like he shares narrative duties with Tom Hardy. You know, he tells you what's going on, he presents the problems. I feel like sometimes he's speaking more for the benefit of the camera than for whoever he's happening to speak to on the set, as it were, at any given moment. So he enjoys this kind of role which is bigger than the show, or bigger than any other character in the show in the way that he speaks. Levy, I think, is very, very different in the sense that Levy is obviously not comfortable on camera. He's not a showman. He's not a publicist. He's very, very different, I think, personality-wise, than Mourinho. And while Mourinho looks totally at home on camera all the time, Levy doesn't.
I think the perception of me is I'm hard-nosed, stubborn, don't care, not ambitious. I think a lot of that isn't fair. I certainly think I'm incredibly ambitious to improve the team. They just don't understand how hard it is to get to that place.
Yeah. And it does mean that they have these quite a few like very sort of strange, stilted conversations between Mourinho and Levy, where Levy will ask Mourinho to explain something to him and will look kind of in awe of Mourinho as Mourinho explains like some quite minor detail, like Christian Eriksen's contract situation, or why he dropped Harry Winks, or why Harry Winks is now playing well, or anything like that. And Levy just looks so impressed with Jose. That dynamic is quite interesting in the show. Maybe we're seeing a more real Levy in the show than a more real Mourinho, and maybe Levy's inability to act is actually just the real him. But I found, like, if you're not that interested in like the tittle-tattle stuff and you're more interested in the sort of personal dynamics, then I do think that Mourinho-Levy dynamic is really interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the phrase on the set, as it were, and something the show focuses on a lot, Jose's half-time team talks.
First thing, you cope with the fucking pressure. We are losing 2-0. You cope with that. You don't run away from that. You face that. You are losing 2-0. Second thing is you believe. You believe that you are not going to lose. You even believe that you can win.
And it's almost like the dressing room is a natural amphitheatre for those portrayals of himself. What did you make of the halftime team talks in the show?
He's a very good talker, I think is the first thing to say. Like, I remember watching the City one of these 2 years ago, and Guardiola is just not a very good talker. Like, simply put, like, it's just hard to pick up what he's saying. Like, he speaks very quickly, very accented, whereas Mourinho has a real grasp of rhetorical skill. And that's been true throughout his whole career. Like, he's so good at press conferences. He's clearly very good at talking to players. While Guardiola makes football incredibly complex, Mourinho is able to make football very simple. And he gives his instructions to the players in a very simple way. And sometimes it can be very persuasive. There are some team talks that you hear and you think, yeah, that's actually like a really... So if you were a player, you'd be like, yeah, let's fucking do it. Like, this is really sort of... It kind of gets you going. But then there are times where I feel like he's scraping the barrel a bit. As the show goes on, he's falling back more on like more energy, more balls, more spirit, more drive, rather than like giving the players something that they can practically do on the pitch. That said, there is talk, and I can't confirm this, but there is talk that Mourinho didn't want some of his more in-depth tactical stuff to go out on there because he didn't want other teams to know precisely how they were doing. I don't know whether or not that's the case. Maybe it is, and that's why the show shows more motivational stuff. It is interesting. Like it's interesting, and you feel like you learn more from watching Mourinho's team talks than you do with Guardiola's ones with City, just because it's easier to understand. Like, I think the average viewer, I count myself as one of those, would generally struggle to learn much from Pep's talks on the City documentary just because they're so like inaccessible.
I was going to ask you about the obvious emotional aspect to the whole series, and there's plenty of examples of emotion and qualities like leadership being called out in. There's a moment when Dele is visibly frustrated after a loss, and Eric Dyer calls out his attitude.
Fucking same every single game. Same problem. So, why you keep on saying these comments? Because nothing's changed. Okay, well then put a name on them at least, yeah? Keep on sitting there the whole way. Oh, shit goes. Oh, same problem.
It's the same fucking problem. How can I name it? It's not one person.
Just sit there.
What, do you mean to go around the whole fucking team? Do you mean to go around the whole team?
Just sit there like a spoiled kid.
Do you mean to name both? I'm not saying, I'm at fault as well. I'm not naming anyone because it's a whole fucking team.
Okay, then put a name on it.
What did you make about that whole angle to the notion of attitude in the series?
That's a good question. I think a show like this is inevitably going to big up attitude, personality and personal conflict as like the driving force of a football team, because that is just more interesting and more accessible than tactics, team play, coaching, that sort of thing. Your average Amazon Prime subscriber is not really going to watch like an 8-part series about how Tottenham mastered the kind of lopsided 4-2-3-1 system, or how the players learned how to interpret Mourinho's methods on the pitch, or the difference between Pochettino and Mourinho's pressing systems, or whatever. You know, some people might like that, but I think generally speaking, the average viewer wouldn't. So clearly a show like this is going to have to be driven more by Kane loves Mourinho, Mourinho hammers Dele, how will he react, Rose versus Mourinho, all those kind of like personality clashes. It's much easier to build a like engaging narrative drama around the question of, do celebrities get on with each other or not? So I think it kind of makes total sense for that stuff to be so front and centre of the show. And it also makes it fun. Like, it is, whether or not footballers get on together is just a question that a lot of people care about. Journalistically, a story that will always perform really well is a story about like who said what to whom in the dressing room, or who's getting on with who hates who had a row at the training ground. Those kind of stories perform incredibly well for reporting outlets, so it makes total sense for this show to like big up that element of it so much.
Why do you think the club agreed to this series in the first place?
I think primarily because Daniel Levy wants to build Tottenham into being one of the biggest clubs in the world. You know, they've obviously been a pretty good team in the last 5 years. They finished second and third under Pochettino. They got to the Champions League final. But they're not like a global mega brand on the level of City, Liverpool, Chelsea, Arsenal, PSG, Real Madrid, Man United, etc. And Levy wants to get them there. I think a lot of what he's done in the last year or so, appointing Mourinho, letting the Amazon documentary cameras in, even re-signing Gareth Bale, signing Alex Morgan, kind of fits in with that global brand building exercise. And I think that global brand building exercise is connected to a desire one day to sell the club for £2 billion or more, which is something that Levy's been working on in the background for quite a while. He's been talking to plenty of people about a potential sale or selling an equity stake. That is the crucial background context for the decision to let in the Amazon documentary cameras, and I think that explains a lot of Levy's thinking on this kind of thing. To be honest, I think whether you think that's the right direction for Tottenham or not, I think that doing this documentary, appointing Mourinho and signing Bale does fit in well with that goal. Like, Tottenham are just a more talked about team than they were in the past, even though they were probably a better team on the pitch under Pochettino than they are now. The other thing to mention here is the NFL franchise. Of course, it's not possible at the moment because of coronavirus, but up until a year ago, the prospect of having regular NFL games or even an NFL team based in Tottenham would have been hugely powerful for the Tottenham brand worldwide. So I think you've got to see it as part of that, you know, that attempt to build Spurs into a much bigger brand than they are now.
Do you think it was a risky decision by Spurs, given that they didn't know that the season was going to unfold in the way that it did?
It depends how willing Spurs would have been to air their dirty laundry in public versus the desire to give the world a really compelling show. Like, as it happened, it was a pretty traumatic season in the sense they sacked their most popular manager since Bill Nicholson, replaced him with Mourinho. The season kind of went to shit a bit on the pitch, and then coronavirus happened, and then they managed to scrape 6th place in the end. So in a sense, that made it a more interesting show than the City one, where the documentary was attempting to like manufacture dramatic tension in a season where City won literally every match. I think in a sense, like, the drama did make it a better show than if it had just been Pochettino all the way through. The other problem they would have had with it being Pochettino all the way through is Pochettino wasn't really on board with this. Like, he did his bit, like he did interviews, but Pochettino would always get a veto on what was filmed and what wasn't, and that's why I don't think there's any dressing room footage from the Pochettino era. Whereas when Mourinho came in, Mourinho didn't have that veto. Like Levy said, look, this is happening, you've got to get on board with it. In that sense, I think the drama has actually worked in Tottenham's favour, even if the results on the pitch weren't so good. But then I don't think it would have been a substantially better show if Spurs had been good and finished third, just because when you're actually watching these shows, what you really want to see is arguments. You don't really want to see and then Tottenham won again, because the City one had a lot of that and it was a worse show for it, I think.
Have you had any sense from the club itself about how it feels now that the series has come out? Are they happy with the interest that's drummed up by it?
I think the club are happy with the interest, because that is what they did it for. It's got people talking about Tottenham. I'm sure it will boost Tottenham's standing outside the UK, which is obviously hugely, hugely important to them. So in that sense, I'm sure it's been very, very successful. I don't know whether they have any issues with the content of the show. I would imagine not, just because the content itself was so curated. So I think the club are broadly happy with it. I know some of the reviews have said it wasn't really a documentary, but then the club can't really take issue with that, and they would have known that all along.
What about the players themselves? Have you had the chance to talk to any of them about the series?
Yeah, so I get the impression from various players and dressing room sources that some people think it was a little bit kind of manipulated by the club, or it was done to show the club in a good light, or done to show Daniel Levy in a good light. That's something I know. I know that originally the players were not very comfortable with the idea of it, and they basically had to get talked into it by the club. And the players as well, I noticed a big uptick in the number of cameras and microphones when Mourinho replaced Pochettino. I think initially there wasn't that much access, like I said, and then when Mourinho showed up, the club basically doubled all the cameras and mics. So that was a big change.
What surprised you most about the series when you watched it?
I think what surprised me most probably was Levy's willingness to go on camera and be filmed. Some conversations that Levy had I just thought were a bit staged. Levy and Mourinho talking about transfers or players, in the players' canteen on camera. I just thought, if they were really going to do that, they would probably try and do it off camera, and so to see them do it on camera makes me think they decided, let's do this on camera.
The deal is far from done.
I've checked all his home life, how he's living there, it's fine. Personality-wise, he's exactly what the squad needs.
But I think the reality is we need to know that we've done the deal.
Yeah.
Some of the Mourinho stuff just looks very, very staged. Like the famous bit where he turns the TV off and says, fuck off, which everyone's seen because it's gone round. I was kind of impressed that they showed the Danny Rose Mourinho confrontation. That is a real event. That wasn't staged. That was genuine.
I play once every 4 weeks. Do you want me to be man of the match and you want me to give my best performance when I play one game and then I don't play again for 3 or 4 weeks? The defence has kept 2 clean sheets. They play every game. It's not fair.
I think it says a lot for Rose's just forthrightness, that he was willing to march into a room where he knew he was being filmed and say it. I think Danny comes out of that very well. The bit, though, where Rose goes up to Levy and asks if he can go to Milan, and then Levy tells him that, in fact, he has to go to Newcastle because even Bournemouth won't pay his wages.
Did you follow from Milan?
Yeah, Milan is a no at the moment.
Okay.
Because they were hoping to sell something to PSV,
okay,
and it hasn't happened. So, things can change. But
yeah. Well, yeah, if you hear anything, just keep me hope.
Okay. All right, no problem.
Okay.
That bit felt slightly unreal to me. I just don't think that conversation would happen in the players' canteen while all the other players were sat around. I imagine it would probably happen in a slightly different setting. Maybe the producers were keen to get that bit recorded. When Kane and Vertonghen, I think, were talking the day after Pochettino was sacked, and Vertonghen said something like, "Did you know this was happening?"
Well, I spoke to him last night.
And apparently they knew already, no? Then? No?
The chairman came in and said, can I talk? Still being sacked. You need to pack your things and you leave tonight.
It just feels like a conversation that they've been told to have while they were sat on a table which had a microphone on. And if they were really going to talk about it, they probably would have WhatsApped each other the previous evening or done something else that wouldn't have been picked up by Amazon. So all shows like this lie somewhere between being a real documentary and then keeping up the Kardashians, and in the sense that how scripted they are. Some of those bits felt a little bit more scripted.
What about the surprising omissions from last season that struck you as odd?
Yeah, there's a few good ones. So the obvious one is the sacking of Pochettino. The collapse under Pochettino in the first few months of the season was a massive story in and of itself, and yet it's only given 22 minutes on the show in like half of the first episode. And there's nothing saying like, this is how they did it, this is when they did it, this is Levy telling Pochettino he's got to go. They just like allude to the fact that Spurs are playing badly, and then they go to, I think, a clip from the radio or from BBC News, say Pochettino's been sacked by Spurs. And that felt like a huge omission. The sacking of Pochettino is still like the biggest thing to happen in Tottenham in the last few years, just because he was their best manager since Nicholson. So it feels really odd not to have that recorded in detail. Maybe Pochettino didn't want his sacking to be filmed, but I felt like they could have done more to recognise that. And then during coronavirus, they didn't mention the furloughing of staff. Spurs tried to furlough some of their non-playing staff. Then they reversed that decision. And then a month or two later, they took a £175 million loan as part of the Bank of England project for loaning money to big businesses during coronavirus. And so, you know, obviously like hugely influential decisions towards the club. The furloughing thing was incredibly controversial. And clearly they decided not to talk about it on camera. And, you know, I get why they would do that, because it's a pretty awful PR move from Spurs and they got hammered for it. But it felt strange to devote a whole episode to the question of how do Spurs cope with the issue of coronavirus? And then for it all to be about like, oh, well, have the players got bikes to train at home? Or, you know, what games are going to be played and when? Or Mourinho zooming his players and trying to keep them fit? And not this fundamental question about furloughing. So Pochettino and furloughing both felt like big misses, which again kind of underlined the extent to which this was not a behind-the-scenes documentary in the sort of conventional sense.
In the 1970s, Hunter Davies wrote a famous book, The Glory Game, which documents the time he spent with unfettered access to Bill Nicholson's Spurs. Comparing those two media, what do we learn about the passage of time from the two different treatments of behind-the-scenes Spurs?
That's a really interesting one. I actually haven't read that book, but I can imagine that it's probably exposes a lot. So I've read, not quite the same, but Pete Davis's book, All Played Out, about Italia 90, in which he spends a lot of time with the England squad and has these incredible stories of the behaviour of the England squad and what it's all like in their camp in Sardinia. And clearly, I think, you know, back in kind of the good old days of journalists writing behind-the-scenes books, I don't know this, but I would imagine that there would be far less like pre-approval from clubs or officials or PR people. It's not like that book was a joint venture between the England team and the author, just like I don't imagine that the Hunter Davies book was a joint venture between Tottenham and Hunter Davies. With the Amazon thing, you have to be aware that it's not like a documentary crew have gone into a situation with a view of like telling the true story of what's actually going on there. Like, it's not like a news team, or it's not like they're making a documentary about, you know, horrendous conditions in kind of bad housing or whatever. Like, that isn't what this is. Like, this is a joint attempt between Amazon and Tottenham to grow the profile of Tottenham. It is not a conventional documentary. You have to remember that when you watch it. You are reminded of it all the time by virtue of what's included and what isn't. If you keep that in your mind, I think it can still be worthwhile to watch. Like, it's still interesting, you'll still learn things. But you obviously have to bear in mind that it's not the kind of unvarnished truth.
Are you a fan of Football Today? Why not support the show and sign up to our new Patreon page? You'll get access to bonus episodes, full and unedited interviews, and lots more extra content. To join us, just visit patreon.com and search for Football Today. Now back to today's episode. Presenting Tottenham Hotspur as the subject of a documentary offers them up as something to be scrutinised by an audience. But for many people, they are a football club, the object of their affections often over a long period of time. To find out what the fans thought of this docu-series, I spoke to Chris Miller, the host of the Extra Inch podcast. They recently produced a watch-along podcast series, tracing All or Nothing through all of its 9 episodes.
It didn't deliver what I expected it to deliver, but it was enjoyable if I just watched it in a kind of, I'm a Spurs fan and here's some Spurs content way.
Looking back at All or Nothing now, how would you describe it as an account of where Spurs is at in 2020?
This is where I feel like it was missing a trick. And although I'm told that there was a Spurs producer working on this, I felt like it wasn't that authentic and wasn't that true to the real narrative at Spurs. I mean, the fact that they dealt with Mauricio Pochettino in 20 minutes was a shame because he is the best Tottenham manager in my lifetime. And it felt like he was a bit of an afterthought and they just felt they had to just shove something in there to sort of give context to the Jose Mourinho show. And I think if you're a fan of Jose Mourinho and if you're a fan of what he's done with Spurs so far, then you'll get lots out of the documentary and you'll probably think it is roughly where Spurs are in 2020. But for me, it didn't quite nail that. And I feel as though there was some contextual information missing, which perhaps would have been useful. But then I appreciate also that this is a show for the masses. It's a show that's gone out on Amazon, a huge American audience, not all of whom will be that familiar with Tottenham Hotspur. And so the detailed nuance might have been lost anyway. And perhaps in some respects it didn't matter.
You've mentioned there that these series are aimed at the masses. They are aimed at a general audience. Do you think that as a result of that, something is lost from them for the fans? As you're watching it as a Spurs fan who knows a lot about the ins and outs of the club, is there anything there for you?
There's definitely something there for fans. It's mainly the stuff with the players. It's mainly the changing room scenes or the training ground scenes. They're the really fascinating insights because we all have our preconceived ideas about what the players are like behind closed doors. And suddenly we're actually getting to see the reality of that, which is quite interesting and also makes you realise that they're human, they have emotions, and it brings you closer to the players in a way that you perhaps weren't before. So there is definitely something there for the fans. In terms of emotional investment, I feel as though it felt like quite a PR-savvy documentary. And there was definitely a disconnect between the community and the club from my perspective. There was some sort of trips out of players to go and do things in the local community, but it felt very airbrushed, very club-controlled. I wanted to see them sit down and interview members of the community about the impact that the building of the stadiums had or the rejuvenation of the local area. That would have been really fascinating. I would have loved to have heard about that, but they missed a trick there for sure.
As a Spurs fan, how do you feel about Amazon making a documentary about your club? Do you feel exploited at all?
There's definitely an element of exploitation involved. This is my club, and you're holding a mirror to my club for other people to see, and the way you're presenting it is not the way that I've grown up with it. My experience of supporting the club is very different to what was shown on screen, and so I definitely feel slightly exploited in that sense. I completely appreciate from the club's perspective why they would want to do this. It's absolutely huge. Our club is being held up on Amazon as like the English club this year. That's insane, and so it's fantastic from a marketing perspective. I did have a sort of slightly emotional reaction in the first episode where I hit play on the first episode. I sort of felt, wow, this is a huge part of my identity. I sort of felt quite exposed in a way. By episode 4 or 5, that had whittled away somewhat and I realised that it wasn't quite what I had in mind.
What about the general fan reactions about the All or Nothing series? Is it generally agreed that the fans liked it?
I think most fans just like content about their club, to be honest. And this was quite vanilla at times, and I think people accepted that it was quite vanilla, but just took what they could from it. But quite a lot of reaction to our first episode because we were quite surprised by some of Jose Mourinho's behaviours and the way that he came across on screen. Not all fans had the same reaction as us, and so they felt we were being particularly critical and negative towards our manager. Beyond that, I think people just enjoyed the fact that we put some content out to go alongside it, and they just enjoyed having like this additional 3 hours of Spurs in their week, which I completely appreciate because I've found the same.
You've mentioned that it's a good thing for your club to have been dramatised by Amazon in the way that they were. Do you think there's any downsides to that dramatisation?
Definitely. It definitely allows the club to sort of airbrush history to some degree. I mean, if I put it kindly, I say the producers can airbrush history. I think the club must have been involved in some of the creative direction, particularly around lockdown and COVID and furloughing staff and some of the decisions the club made at the time. That stuff was very much glossed over in a way that I totally expected, but I thought perhaps it could have been handled a little more delicately, perhaps. So I would say it's been unhelpful in the respect that, yes, it allows the club to have complete narrative control. It allows Amazon or the club to say, look at Jose Mourinho coming in and saving Spurs. Isn't he a hero? When actually that's not quite the reality of the situation as we've seen it over the last year.
Do you anticipate any blowback from that kind of thing in the future?
If things go tits up, then they'll look a bit foolish, for sure. Although there's always a way to spin it, isn't there? There's always a way to spin it and say things weren't right because of X, Y, and Z reasons. So you can never kind of escape the narrative in that sense.
So much of sports media is now about PR, and you've already mentioned that at times this felt like a little bit of an exercise. What sense did you have that this series was about optics for the club? Does it feel like a puff piece, or is there enough balance between there being stuff of interest in there as well?
I definitely feel like it was at times a puff piece. There were a couple of examples of the players doing things in the local community, which I actually really enjoyed in all cases. One of them was Lucas Moura attending a stadium tour and surprising a Brazilian child.
And now, guys, we are in the press auditorium, so are there any questions? What about you at the start?
Yes, I have one question, please. Yeah, no problem. How are you? Brasileiro? Tudo bem?
It's like, hey, look, Lucas is actually here after all. And it's this big moment. But that exact clip was used in Spurs' social media around that event. So the PR was already there, and then it was replicated in the show, which I found slightly strange, that they would sort of not try and hide the fact that this was a complete PR exercise. There was another section where Harry Winks goes to a day centre and socialises with some older people, and he is absolutely delightful, and he's completely natural with these people, and it's very sweet, very endearing.
Was you much of a football fan?
I think you should be in there. I played down the Spurs with my father.
Would you pick Billy Rice in your team?
Oh, really? You like Tottenham?
Tottenham played.
Yeah.
I don't like Tottenham.
Who was your favourite?
He was a goalkeeper.
Gordon Banks. He was good choice in, wasn't he?
But it's very much like the club saying, look at what we do for the community. You kind of want to see it from the other perspective. You want to see the community members and hear them tell you what the club does for them. Because if it's all coming from the club side, it feels quite controlled. So yeah, I definitely think there was a PR element to it. And aside from that, you know, the amount of stadium shots, they literally advertised the Skywalk in the last episode, which was insane to me. But that's how they want this to come across. They want this to be an opportunity for people to see what they can come and do at the stadium.
So we've had a fair few of these docu-series now focusing on football clubs. We've seen Manchester City, Juventus, Sunderland, Leeds United as well. There's so many of them out there. When we look back on these series in 100 years' time, what do you think we'll make of them as a sort of cultural phenomenon?
It's really interesting, and I think it is quite dependent on the series itself. So Sunderland Till I Die, for me, had a really good feel for community. There was a real warmth, there was a real heart at the centre of that. I don't think Amazon's All or Nothing Tottenham Hotspur has the same warmth, the same heart. And although there are some really lovely moments, some really heartwarming moments, it's lacking in authenticity, and it's lacking in what it means to be a Tottenham fan and what it means to have this club at the centre of your identity. So I think we'll look back and say, wasn't Premier League football exciting? And that'll pretty much be it.
You can find all of Jack Pitt-Brook's coverage of Tottenham and England on The Athletic. Chris Miller is the host of the Extra Inch podcast and also appears on 15 Minutes with Flav and Windy, a podcast in which Flav and Windy devote 15 minutes to a random topic. The music for this episode was provided under the Creative Commons license by Blue Dot Sessions, and the details of the individual songs can be found in the show notes. This episode was produced by Josh Schneiderweiler. I'm John Mackenzie. Thanks for listening to Football Today.